Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Logic Without Math. I will be discussing some logical fallacies that involve some trickery or sleight of hand that is sometimes hard to detect and can be easy to create without intention. I have previously explained what is meant by a fallacy and an argument, so just for a short recap, an argument is where someone suggests that one statement, the conclusion, is true because it is implied by the truth of another statement or statements, the premise or premises. A fallacy occurs where the premises, even if true, do not in fact provide support for the conclusion. The value of learning fallacies does not consist just in learning how to not be fooled by others, but also to create an argument clinic in which we learn how to make better arguments ourselves. To that end, I will start off by saying that however good it might be to develop our abilities to spot fallacies, we must always bear in mind that just because a fallacy has been committed does not of itself prove any proposition to be false. It could be that the other person just makes a bad argument for a true conclusion, and given this possibility, we should only conclude that our opponent made an invalid argument. So let us guard against ourselves committing the fallacy. One way of creating bad reasoning that sounds persuasive is to take advantage of the fact that there are many words and languages that may have more than one meaning, depending upon the context. An end, for instance, can be the termination of something, but it can also mean a purpose, as when I eat, my desired end is to satisfy hunger. If the word is used in the same sense throughout the argument, this doesn't create a problem, but if we use the term in different senses, it creates an invalid argument. If I argue, for instance, that since the end of a thing is its perfection, and death is the end of life, consequently death must be the perfection of life, I would be using the term in different senses in the premises. When a term is used in different senses in any combination of premises and conclusion, the argument commits the fallacy of equivocation. I have covered previously how this fallacy can often occur in syllogisms, effectively creating a fourth term where there should only be three, but it can happen anywhere. One joke that I like as an example of this is that if you consider Newton's theory of gravitation, you know that the gravitational pull that any mass-possessing particle exerts upon any other increases with its mass. Therefore, fat women must be more attractive. The trick here is that the term attraction is actually not used in the premise, but it is there in the form of a synonymous gravitational pull. In trying to establish something that seems self-evident, but not believed by others, we may be tempted in the search for premises to find another way of saying the same thing, hoping it will have convincing force. The temptation to accomplish this saying of the supposedly self-evident in other ways, produces the fallacy of petitio principii, or begging the question. If I were to say that someone is famous because he is famous, that will only be a repetition and sound absurd. The form of this argument is P because P. Of course, in some sense, that argument must be valid because the premise, if true, must imply the truth of the conclusion because it is the same proposition. But if I were to say instead that I know that someone is famous because he is well known, a sleight of hand is being employed here in the use of language. Being well known is what we mean by being famous, and so it creates a funny situation. If I do not already accept the conclusion that he is famous, I am not going to accept the premise given for it that he is well known. This argument has now changed to the form of P because Q, but it also features an addition to the effect of Q equals P. Another example of a premise not being true unless the conclusion already is true occurred when someone told me he knows that God exists and that what the Bible says is true because Jesus appeared to him and told him so. There is a good piece of advice in rhetoric that goes back to the ancient Greeks and is employed in Plato's dialogues, to the effect that, in order to convince someone of what he does not already believe, you should start with something he does already believe and will admit to. Following this advice will have you searching for premises that can themselves be true independently. The religious gentleman I met on the sidewalk clearly did not apply this strategy. Even many people who do believe in God would not be willing to accept that Jesus appeared to him, and certainly an atheist would not. This gentleman had clearly fashioned his appeal in a way that only works when he preaches to the converted, specifically to his or some similar church. The form of his argument was P because Q, but additionally Q only if P, because Jesus could not appear to anyone unless God existed. Another form that begging the question can take is when the argument is circular. Let's consider the argument that we know what is stated in the Bible is true because it says so in the Bible. Here we have two stated terms that are different, but the argument can also go in the other direction. Wherever it says in the Bible that what it is in it is true, we could ask of that statement why we should believe it, just as with stories of creation or Noah's Ark. The answer, of course, is that we're supposed to approach the Bible with the idea that it contains the truth. It's a matter of faith, and most people will not make this argument. So here we have the argument take the form of P because Q and Q because P. Unfortunately, the mainstream media has resorted to the same trickery by claiming that they are the reliable source of information because any other outlet that tells you something contrary to it is spreading misinformation. How do we know that what the others are spreading is misinformation? Well, because they contradict what comes from the reliable source. A fallacy similar to begging the question occurs when one particular word is used as a loaded term. Sometimes a term used in an argument can have an emotive meaning, where a more neutral term could be substituted for it. To give a couple of examples created by Bertrand Russell, I am firm, you are obstinate, he is pig-headed. I am righteously indignant. You are annoyed, he is making a fuss over nothing. These are examples of the same phenomenon being described differently. This may be due to what in psychology is called the fundamental attribution error, where one interprets one's own statements or behavior as a reaction to the other, and interprets the other's behavior or statements as a function of who that person is. But where is the evidence that the other person does not also see himself as reacting? Wars and civil conflict provide an example of this on a group level, where each side may call themselves freedom fighters while calling the others terrorists. In discussing politics, religion, and economics, it may seem natural to try to use our rhetorical skills to get a point across by avoiding bland language and using terms that fit our point of view. In economics, we may observe language like bleeding heart and voodoo economics to describe another person or his opinions without the other person's agreement. Where the term is an insult that is not related to the issue at hand, it falls under the category of the fallacy of argumentum ad hominem, which I discuss in my Fallacies of Abuse. In a debate about capital punishment, Someone who is against it may make an argument that the state adding a second murder does not equal justice, but his opponent may not be likely to agree to calling capital punishment a second murder. It is not just negative terms that can be loaded like this. It may be tempting to package your own ideas in nice-sounding terms, hoping that the opponent will be lulled into thinking that what sounds good must be good. The thing to recognize here about these terms is that the use of one term rather than another assumes the speaker's position to be the one that is valid. We can say that the term is theory-laden, that it has assumptions in it, or that it is ideologically loaded. A good way to respond is to call out the term being used as loaded, if not also to propose a different term. My point here is not to suggest that we should switch to a more bland and unemotional style of rhetoric, but rather to recognize that the other person having a different point of view may not accept the use of the term as applicable. We should be prepared to defend the use of the term, and even, especially in writing, give justification for its use. The logical question of when the use of the term becomes a logical fallacy is whether the term is a substitution for argumentation, such that it functions as an unjustified assumption or premise. The truth or falsity of the conclusion that the speaker or writer wishes to draw will not depend solely on which term he uses to describe something. Therefore, some justification for the use of the term will need to be added. When someone uses a loaded term and does not provide some reason for it being applicable, he commits the fallacy of loaded term. Most of the time an argument is employed to establish a proposition that concerns a matter of fact. The appeal in the premises may be to general propositions or other facts to establish it. However, when an argument appeals to a sentiment of pity to establish a question of fact, it commits the fallacy of argumentum ad misericordiam, or appeal to pity. Our sentiments, no matter how noble they might be, can never establish facts to be true. A classical paradigm example of this is the child who, after having killed his parents, being confronted in court with the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, pleads with the judge to have mercy on him because he is an orphan. A defense attorney like Clarence Darrow may want to talk to the jury about the plight of the downtrodden, hoping that the jury may be willing to throw questions of evidence out the window for the benefit of a defendant who may have been living under bad circumstances. In these examples, the person to be pitied can be argued to have created his own problem, but in real life it does not always happen that way. Poverty from unemployment, underemployment, depressed wages, failed businesses, or disability can be involuntary. There are people who believe that governments should do more to alleviate poverty. If such persons only engage in appeals to pity alone, their arguing is fallacious. However, insofar as they additionally argue from economic, moral, or political theories and facts that may support them, the fallacy is not engaged. The point of calling out the appeal to pity as invalid comes from the inability of sentiment alone to establish the truth of a proposition that is not about the sentiment. One fallacy that occurs often in conversations about the unknown or disputed involves assuming that what has not been proven true is false, or that what has not been proven false is true. The classic example of the fallacy is the argument that ghosts exist because nobody has ever proven that they do not. My point here is not the unfairness of expecting a negative to be proven, but rather that our ignorance of something, our ignorance of how to prove something, does not give us knowledge and cannot itself prove or disprove any proposition. Anyone who argues that a proposition is true because it has not been proven false, or false because it has not been proven true, commits the fallacy of argumentum ad ignorantium, or appeal to ignorance. This fallacy applies only to conversations about the unknown, or what cannot be proven one way or another. I am not talking about what would have been proven one way or another by now. For instance, we could say that the theory that the world will end in 2012 has been disproven, and there should be no dispute about it. In a criminal law context, if a store robbery has been thoroughly investigated, with no evidence indicating you did it, the police should not be arresting you if their only reason is because you were alone somewhere else at the time and cannot prove your alibi. It might be argued that in a legal context, the criminal courts provide a counterexample to this with the idea that a defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. The key word here is presumed. This legal rule has a special purpose in ensuring that state punishment does not fall upon the accused, where the judge or jury is not sure that the defendant is guilty. And this is why the choice of verdict is guilty or not guilty, with innocent left out. The idea is to put the burden of proof upon the state to prove a proposition or not get what it wants. In politics especially, this can create an atmosphere of disrespect if someone always wants to get his way until and unless he admits he is proven wrong. Normally in academic debate, it is the person who takes a positive position or proposes a change that speaks first while the opponent enjoys the luxury of rebuttal. Thomas Sowell in particular has complained in at least one debate of a tendency among leftists looking to change what he says works to insist that he accept a burden to prove them wrong to their satisfaction or accept the changes that they want. They may believe themselves to be entitled to this privilege because they say they fight for social justice, but this is an example of a loaded term. Whatever you might think of that, any rebuttal or attitude to the effect that the opponent has not proven his case and is therefore mistaken commits the fallacy of argumentum ad ignorantium, even if it is not also arrogant. Well, that's all for now. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like and subscribe, and check out my other videos. Thanks for watching.